Hey guys, in today's video, I want to give you the top 5 tennis strings of all time for the recreational level and also for the pro level. And I'm going to start with the pro level with a caveat that the strings that I'm about to list are not necessarily going to be strings that you should play with. Some of you might be able to pull these strings off, but the first part of this video for most of you guys is going to be informative, and the second part of the video are going to be the strings that I recommend for the recreational level and the strings that I place in the top 5 of all time. And let's get started with the top 5 professional level strings of all time. And coming in at number 5 is the Wilson Natural Gut. Now this string was used by Roger Federer, and he used it in a hybrid setup. And why are natural gut strings so popular? Well, we have to look at the history of tennis, because the vast majority of professional players used to primarily use natural gut. This all changed in the early 2000s, which I'm going to get to later on in this video. And what does natural gut give professional level players? It gives them a combination of power, feel, and control. And remember that tennis back in the day was played differently. Players relied a lot more on feel than they do nowadays. Now, one important word that I'm going to use today when I'm describing these strings is responsiveness. And this word will perfectly describe how professional tennis evolved and how the materials, especially the strings, changed over time. But also responsiveness is going to be a super important factor when it comes to choosing a string when you are at the recreational level. And I'm going to rate all the strings that I'm talking about on a scale of 1 to 10 for responsiveness. And the Wilson Natural Gut gets a 7 out of 10 for responsiveness. Now, what is responsiveness? In other words, when you hit a ball with a string, does this string do a lot of the work for you? If the answer is yes, then you have a responsive string on your hands. If you play with a string that is not very responsive, in other words, dead, now the string itself is not going to give you that much power. You have to be the one that's going to generate this power. The 4th greatest tennis string in the history of professional tennis is the Babolat Touch VS Natural Gut string. It is the most widely used natural gut string at the professional level, and it's still used by some players today, mostly in a hybrid setup. But back in the day, players used to have a full bed of the Babolat VS. How does the Babolat Natural Gut compare to the Wilson Natural Gut? It is very similar. It's very difficult to feel a difference between these two strings. I've played with both. So what I said about the Wilson Natural Gut applies to the Babolat string as well. The 3rd greatest string of all time at the professional level is the Babolat RPM Blast. And you see this little thing right here used by Rafa. And this is really true. Rafa uses this string, but not only Rafa, many other professional level players, but also high level players in general, high level juniors. And this string actually is used by some players at the recreational level. Now, what makes the Babolat RPM Blast string so great? Well, it's its control and responsiveness. So on a scale from 1 to 10, I'm going to rate the Babolat RPM Blast as 6 out of 10. So not quite as responsive as Natural Gut, but it is not as dead as some other polyester strings. And why do I say that? Because you see here what it says on the back. This is a monofilament polyester string, which means that it's a single material in this string. And these type of strings tend to be more responsive in general. Now, one downside of this type of string is that because the string is a little bit stiffer, it doesn't provide you with the same type of feel that you would get on a natural gut string. This string is designed for power tennis. If players have swing paths that promote topspin, which most professional players do, this type of string will produce more topspin. And it is one of the greatest strings that combines the factors of responsiveness and control. In other words, you don't necessarily have to swing like a madman to get power. This string will help you out quite a bit. The 2nd greatest string in the history of tennis at the professional level is the Luxilon Alu Power. If you take a look at the ATP Top 100, you're going to see that the vast majority of players use the Alu Power string. And if you take a look at the WTA rankings, you're going to see a little bit less of this string, but still there's going to be a lot of female players that use the Alu Power string. It is by far the most popular string at the professional level. Now, when it comes to responsiveness, I'm gonna rate this string a 2 out of 10. So in other words, it is a string that's very dead. So you're probably thinking, Nick, why would players like a string like this? Well, the vast majority of players likes the feeling of being able to hit full out on the ball. So if you have a monofilament string that's very responsive, let's say a string that I rate 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10, this is not going to be a string that's suited for the elite level, because players would not be able to control the ball as well as they can with a string like this. Because of the deadness of the string, players have the ultimate control to be able to swing fully on their strokes. Now this is super important because number 5 and number 4 were the natural gut strings, and number 3 was the RPM blast. Especially the natural gut strings are going to be strings that you can use at the recreational level, and some recreational players will find quite a bit of comfort playing with the RPM blast because it is a monofilament string and it is responsive as long as it's strung lower than 50 pounds. However, there's going to be very few, if any, recreational players who are going to be able to pull off a string like this. And why do I say that? Because what a professional player feels and what you are feeling are two completely different things. A professional level player can comfortably, without getting any physical issues, use a dead string like this. Why? Because they have the swing speed, they have the control and the strength to be able to pull off a dead string like this. What happens with recreational players that put a string like this on their racket is that the string will give them absolutely nothing. It's going to be completely dead, and now they're forced to swing bigger than they ever have in order to get the same amount of power that they normally have. And now naturally there's a big chance that your shoulder is going to start hurting, or even worse, that you might get tennis elbow. And coming in at number 1 as the greatest tennis string of all time, the string that truly revolutionized tennis, is the Luxilon Big Banger Original. This string came around in the early 2000s. It was first used by Gustavo, and this string revolutionized tennis because polyester strings have been around way before this string came out. In fact, in the 90s, where I still played in juniors and then transitioned into the adult circuit, I used monofilament polyester strings. And then towards the end of the 90s, early 2000s, I started noticing that a lot of my friends that I was training with who played tennis at the high level started to switch to this string or strings that are very similar to this one. Now, I never liked the dead feeling of this string, but I could see the advantage of it, because basically what this string allowed players to do is to swing at full speed without losing control. When Agassi first tried this string at the tournament in Rome, he renamed this string to Cheetah because he didn't think that this string should be legal. He thought it was as if he was cheating having this string on his racket, because for 2 hours he barely missed any balls. Because you have to understand that the elite level players couldn't play with the monofilament polyester strings that were on the market in the 90s. This string did not provide enough control for the players. And players in the 90s used to primarily play with natural gut. But once this string came on the market, slowly but surely, the vast majority of professional level players started switching to copolyester strings, because this string is not a monofilament, it is a copolyester string, meaning there are additional materials inside of this string that deadens the string and gives it that low power feeling when you hit the ball. Now, just like the Alu Power string, which is very similar to the original Big Banger, I don't recommend this string for the recreational level. Have I seen some recreational players being able to pull this string off? Yes. But these players are in the minority. Some players combine a string like this with natural gut and find comfort with it. As long as there are no physical issues, by all means continue playing with the string. But for the vast majority of recreational players, this is a string that's going to be quite a nightmare to play with, especially if you string it too tight. You're not going to get anything out of it. The ball is going to be dead on your racket, especially if you hit balls off center, and you're going to be forced to hit harder than you ever have to get the same amount of power, which will naturally result in some physical issues. And just like the Alu Power, I'm going to give the Big Banger Original a responsive rating of a 2 out of 10. These two strings are some of the deadest strings that are on the market. Okay, now comes the important part of this video where I talk about the top 5 tennis strings at the recreational level. These are all strings that I recommend you can safely use this string. I'm also going to give you recommendations on how tightly you should string. Now, one important caveat is that if you like your setup, whatever setup it may be, you have no physical problems and the string performs well, you're playing well, in other words, don't make any changes. Why fix something that is not broken? I've been playing with the same string for many years, and the string that I used prior to my last string, I played with that one for 20 years. So there's absolutely no reason for you to switch. However, a lot of you guys are playing with the wrong string, or maybe you have some physical issues, or maybe you're just not playing well. And these top 5 strings are going to be possibly a good solution for you. And coming in at number 5 is the Gosen Polylon string. This is a monofilament, and again we're going to talk about responsiveness, and on a responsiveness scale from 1 to 10 I'm going to rate this one a 7 out of 10. Now this particular string is a 1.24 millimeter or 17 gauge. So generally when we're talking about gauges, the higher the gauges in the US measurement, so if you're looking at 17 gauge or 18 gauge, this is going to be more playable for the type of strings that I'm recommending. In other words, they're going to be more responsive the higher the gauge goes. For all my European fans, this number has to be lower. So the strings that I'm going to recommend are all going to be 1.25 millimeters or lower. I recommend that you string the Gosen Polylon 50 pounds or less, despite the fact that this string is very playable, it's very responsive. In other words, the string is going to do a lot for you. You're not going to have to swing like a madman or a mad woman out there. The string is going to do a little bit of the work for you, which is going to be nice, and your arm is going to be very thankful for that. But despite that fact, if you string too tight, now it's going to feel like a board, because this string, despite being responsive and playable, is somewhat stiff. So for that reason, my recommendation is that you string 50 pounds or less. And do not worry, I know on the racket it says the racket should be strung between 55 and 65 pounds. Disregard that. Now coming in at number 4 is the Luxilon 4G string. This is one of the Luxilon strings that I do recommend, and this is a string that's used all the way from the professional level to the recreational level. Now why do I recommend this string from Luxilon and not others? Because this string is responsive. On a scale from 1 to 10, I would rate it a 6 out of 10. Now it's super important that you listen to what I'm about to say. Do not string the Luxilon tennis strings above 50 pounds. If you string the Luxilon 4G at 55 pounds or 60 pounds, it's going to feel more dead. So this string in particular has to be strung in the 40s for you to get the responsiveness out of it. Once it's strung too tight, it loses its responsiveness, and now you're stuck with the same problems that I described earlier, where you're not going to get the string to work for you and it's going to feel extremely uncomfortable. I recommended this string to many recreational players, and it's always 17 gauge, 1.25 millimeters, and I have not heard one complaint. But these players also listen to me carefully, and they don't allow the stringer to string the racket too tight, because what's going to happen to you if you go to your stringer and you say, okay, I want my racket strung with 4G and I want 38 pounds, they're going to think you're insane, and they're going to say it's going to be too loose, it's going to be like a trampoline. Don't listen to that. You can safely string the Luxilon 4G between 35 and 40 pounds. It's going to feel perfect. It's not going to feel like a trampoline. On the other hand, you go too high in the tension and now you got big problems on your hand. Now coming in at number 3 is Head Hawk. And this is one of the best strings for the recreational level. And why do I say that? Because this is a monofilament polyester strings. Now these type of strings were around in the 90s and they're slowly disappearing. I will say that even though these strings are labeled as monofilament, it's not the same type of monofilament that was around in the 90s when I grew up, where you hit the strings against your hand and you had that loud pinging sound. That type of string doesn't exist anymore. Even strings of the same brand, for example, a string that I was using for 20 years was exactly the same string, but I noticed that the string would change over the years. So the manufacturer, without telling anybody, would start changing the materials in the string. I know they do this with rackets as well. It's very annoying, but it is what it is. But generally, when we have monofilament polyester strings, not all of them, but the Head Hawk in particular will give you a lot of responsiveness. You're going to feel a lot of comfort playing with this string. On a scale from 1 to 10, I'm going to give the Head Hawk an 8 out of 10. In other words, this string will do a lot of the work for you. You're not going to have to swing that hard, and that's going to translate to more playability, an ease of play, and it's going to be safer for your arm. Now, because this is a monofilament string, you don't have to string it below 50. I would string this string anywhere between 50 and 55 pounds. If you're someone that likes lower tensions in general, you could string this below 50 pounds, but just mind you that this is not going to behave the same way the 4G behaves, and it might be a little bit trampoline if you string this one at 35 pounds, for example. So my recommendation for the Head Hawk monofilament is that you stay between 50 and 55 pounds. Do not string above 55, because even here, the higher you go in tension, the less responsive this string is going to be, and it's going to lose all its benefits for the recreational level. Coming in at number 2 is the Wilson Natural Gut. Now, the reason why I didn't use the Babolat VS Touch Natural Gut, because the Wilson Natural Gut is a lot cheaper than the Babolat Natural Gut, which is the most expensive tennis string on the market. And why is Natural Gut a good solution for the recreational level? Well, first of all, this is a string that can be combined into hybrid setups really well. So any of the strings that I mentioned previously will go perfectly together in a hybrid setup where you go half natural gut and half polyester. You can also go full bed natural gut, and what you're going to have, you're going to have the perfect combination of responsiveness, control, and feel. So on a scale from 1 to 10, I'm going to rate the Wilson Natural Gut a 7 out of 10 for responsiveness, but it's a string that's not so stiff. It's a very elastic string. It's also a string that's going to fray. So none of the other strings that I mentioned will fray on you, but this string will fray. So it's not a string that's very durable. Also, if you expose these strings to weather conditions such as humidity or rain, this string will not handle those conditions too well. So it is very expensive, it doesn't last very long, but the playability is phenomenal. And coming in at number 1, the greatest recreational level string in the history of tennis is Kirschbaum Super Smash in a super thin gauge at 1.23 millimeters. Now, I'm going to make a disclaimer. I do have a relationship with Kirschbaum, and if you're interested in buying this string, I'm going to put a link in my description. You're going to get 10% off. But for you guys that know me well, you know that I was recommending this string completely for free without being associated with Kirschbaum. You guys would always ask, Nick, what's that orange string on your racket? And I would gladly tell you what it is, and a lot of you guys went out and purchased this string. Now, also, many of you guys send me emails, DMs, comments of how this string saved you from tennis elbow. And this is a string that I personally use because despite having a high-level background, I never adapted to those dead strings in the early 2000s. I'm a type of guy that likes the help of the string. I can control the string really well, but I need a little bit of help. When I put a string on my racket that's too dead, I don't like playing with it. So is this string the same as those strings that I loved in the 90s? No, it's not, because even the Kirschbaum Super Smash, which has been around for more than 30 years, has changed over the years. But it is still a monofilament polyester string that is fantastic for the recreational level. And why? Because on a responsiveness scale from 1 to 10, I'm going to rate this string a 9 out of 10. The name does it a lot of justice. You're going to hit super smashes out there. The ball is going to pop off your strings like crazy. Now, because this string is very responsive, you can safely string it between 50 and 55 pounds. If you go towards 60 pounds, you're going to get into a little bit of trouble. If you go towards 65 pounds, this string is going to feel dead like any other strings. Also, if you string this string too loosely, if you go into the 30s, it will feel a little bit like a trampoline. So guys, there you have it. These are my top 5 strings for the recreational level and the pro level. Now, a lot of you guys are wondering, hey Nick, why didn't you mention any multi-filament string or synthetic gut strings? Now, I'm going to tell you why. While these strings are soft, and a lot of people only look at the softness of this string and they relate the softness of the string to this type of string being good for the arm. I don't see it that way, and I have a lot of experience in the recreational tennis world. I can tell you that the multi-filament string, the synthetic gut strings, can cause problems because they are not very responsive. They're somewhere in the middle of the responsiveness scale, generally around a 5 out of 10. Of course, we can't generalize all strings. All strings are going to be a little bit different. Multifilaments also fray, just like the natural gut. And it's unfortunately a string that's very durable, unlike the natural gut. So what happens with a lot of recreational players when they play with multifilament is that the string ends up fraying and fraying and fraying until there's like a little piece of fiber left on the racket and it just won't pop. Now when the string disintegrates in this way, of course it's going to be less and less playable and more dead, and it loses its so important responsiveness. When we're talking about synthetic gut, this is a very cheap string that is of a very low quality, and when you play with synthetic gut, the strings are going to be moving all over the place. The string is not very responsive, and while this might be an okay solution for beginner level players, it's not a string that I recommend generally for the recreational level, because here's what you have to understand. Responsiveness is the number one factor that most of you guys are looking for. Of course, not all of you. Why? Because you want the string to help you out. When you hit the ball, you don't want the ball to be dead on your racket and you having to swing like a lunatic. You want the string itself to have enough power where you don't have to do as much work. The reason why you won't find any soft polyester strings in my top 5 is because, very similarly to the multifilament and the synthetic gut, a softer polyester string loses in its responsiveness. So while soft polyester strings might be better options for the recreational level compared to some of the strings that are used on a professional tour, the biggest factor for recreational players when selecting strings is responsiveness, which directly translates into less effort being exerted, resulting in more comfort and less risk for injury.